Happy Tuesday, everybody. We will go ahead and get started with our webinar. We're happy to have you. This month, we will be talking about the pigments for coatings, and we will record this session. And so that all of the participants in today's webinar will receive the link as well as the PDF so that you can have it for your reference library as well as share it with your other team members. If you have any questions along the way, feel free to use the chat box, and then I'll address them at the end of the presentation. Or if that's not your thing, you can go ahead and reach me directly as well. So with that, we will go ahead and get started. I'm going to go off screen here so that I'm not disturbing myself here, and we'll get started. So, as I mentioned, we will be talking about pigments for coatings as the final installment of some of our more application-specific webinars. So, as far as paint is concerned, it's more than just color, of course. It is applied either as a liquid or a powder, can dry by both chemical and physical processes to a solid state against some sort of substrate. We use paints and coatings for decoration, of course, but however, it also can be used for protection of that particular article. And in a lot of cases, it's used for identification or branding types of activities. So with Sudarshan, we break into two major sections when we talk about pigments for coatings. The first is our general category of architectural coatings. And in this particular category, we include pigments for both interior and exterior architectural coatings, and wood and metal as well. The other category that Sudarshan uses is industrial coatings. In this particular coatings, we split out automotive, both on OEM and refinish, as well as powder coatings into their own subcategories, primarily because they do require some a little bit more unique performance properties, so that we put them in their own categories. And then obviously anything in remaining falls into that general bucket list of general industrial coatings, not to including, but certainly not limited to things like floor coatings, road marking, painting, pigments or paints for plastics and things like that. So it's a big variety of coating types that are in this application area. So when we talk about paint, my little depiction of what paint is obviously very simple on the surface, but it is definitely much more complex than I depict here, and we all know it. Obviously, we'll talk about a lot more about pigments as part of that. And so what I would like to do would be to take you back a little bit to some fundamentals about pigments themselves. Typically, they will come in as the larger particles, which give us the opacity, or the very small ones that give us the transparency, depending on what you're looking for with your coating formulation. The larger particles are going to be absorbing much more light than it reflects back, and that what gives us both the color, but as well as the opacity. And then vice versa. On the flip side is the transparent particles, which are very small and transmit and absorb the light as well. And there's more particles in between, so that you can have that very transparent look, especially when you are combining it with effect pigments. So a few things to consider when talking about pigment is the crystal shape. The pigments come in a number of different shapes as part of the synthesis process. Typical ones are sphere-like, I will call it sphere-like, blocks or platelets. Needle-like it is a very prevalent type of shape. And then everything else kind of falls into that irregular shape size. But the key here is to consider what the aspect ratio is going to be. That helps to determine what the surface area will end up being, and then that also then relates to the amount of surface treatment or surface dispersant that could be required for that particular chemistry in the coating formulation. So crystal shape then falls into the actual physical particles that you might see in the process of using pigments in your formulation. So if we start from the bottom, what you're going to get out of the bag of pigment is clumps of very loosely bound clusters of pigment particles. These we call agglomerates. And these are ones that are going to be ultimately separated during your dispersion process. The next smallest size is what we refer to as the aggregates. These are very tightly bound clusters of pigment particles, and these are not going to be broken down to the very fine primary particle size. And this is because during the synthesis process, once those primary particles are created in the synthesis, those crystals come together directly, and there is a very, very strong bond that is formed, and then they will come together to be able to create that aggregate. So ultimately, the dispersion engineer and formulator will be trying to achieve that aggregate size, not the primary particle size. And the crystal shape then goes into the ultimate size of what that aggregate might look like because of the different sizes. The one can be a little bit more difficult in terms of surface area, so that it will require some more dispersant versus others. And also the separation process from the agglomerate to the aggregate will also be important to consider as far as those sizes are concerned. So we've talked about this, it seems ad nauseum sometimes, as far as the pigment classification. So you're either going to have a pigment, which is a physical solid particle that never completely goes away. And then that's the dyes, which are soluble in the solution, in the resin solution, solvent solution that you are using. So there are no physical solid particles remaining. Pigments, of course, are either organic or inorganic, and then there's a number of subcategories in each one of these segments of pigments. So if we start out with the organic pigments, there are two main types that we talk about: classical and pigments, as well as high performance pigments. The difference primarily is in their fastness and heat resistance properties, with the classical pigments having lower fastness properties and lower heat resistance windows with which to work. And then conversely, the high performance pigments bring in that higher fastness and weather resistance, as well as heat resistance, to be able to work in those higher temperature environments. Now, in between, there are a couple ones that I like to not place in either of these two categories. These are the phthalo blues and greens, as well as the naphthol reds. They straddle both of these major categories, primarily because they have physical properties or technical properties that are very much similar to the high performance pigments, but they are typically more priced like the classical pigments. So I pull these out as the in-between groupings of organic pigments. So each pigment will always come with a very large set of physical parameters. As a manufacturer, we like to have all these available to us so that we know that we're making the correct pigment for for the application that it was designed for. Not all of these you'll find on a TDS or an SDS type of documents, but each of these go into the application, and they directly impact how that particular pigment will perform in the ultimate formulation that you are using. So it's always wise to make sure that you try to balance as many of these as you can with your formulation so that you get the most out of your pigment. In most cases, the pigment portion of your formulation is going to bring in the highest percentage of cost for that formulation. So we want to work with you to make sure that you are getting the most value for that particular pigment that you've chosen. So as I mentioned, the pigment that you choose is only going to be valuable to you if it performs in the manner that you need it to for your application. As you saw in the previous couple of slides, there's a lot of subcategories in coatings that need to be addressed with respect to the pigment choices. And each of those are going to have their own technical requirements, and it is very important to make sure that we match up as best we can to all of those requirements. And every one of you are going to have a listing of your must wants and nice to haves with respect to performance, and we want to make sure that you get as many of those musts and wants as you can to be able to formulate your ultimate coating. So you're going to go through a selection process. Obviously, you're going to consider what color and if you're going to use an effect pigment in that formulation. What type of application are you going to be using it for? The substrate is always of concern in this particular case, as well as the resin system. They all go hand in hand to be able to work together. And then, of course, the pigment that goes into that system needs to work with that resin system. Then, of course, what other ingredients need to be into that formulation? Are there going to be any interactions with the pigment with all of those other additives that are there? And of course, the expectation for fastness properties. Is it going to be an indoor or outdoor? What kind of light fastness and weather fastness is required? Compliance is always another area to consider for the pigment of choice. There are some areas that require potentially food and toy and medical type compliance areas, and we need to match those up as well as the standard other regulatory areas that are sometimes plaguing us at some point in time. But those are big things to consider as you're selecting your pigment. We've talked about cost and value before. Obviously, cost is just the dollar per pound that you would buy the pigment for. Value is how much value does it bring to your formulation? Um, Ideally, you want to get the most out of your pigment. Every pound you put into your formulation, you want to get as many pounds of finished product as you can out of that. So if a pigment might be a little be higher in dollars per pound, but it gives you 10% more strength, or there's some technical properties that extend your use of that particular pigment, that might be a better choice for your particular need. And then, of course, performance. There are many items in terms of performance that have to be considered. It's this very small list that I have in here, but you're going to have a list in your product attributes that you're trying to achieve, and we want to make sure that the selection of the pigment checks as many of those boxes as we can. So as a pigment manufacturing, we do manufacture pigments for a number of different application areas. We make pigments for plastics, coatings, and inks. And each one of those general application areas has specific needs for the dispersion process. Each one of them is very different in terms of the amount of intensity of dispersion and residence time that the pigment will see in each of these applications. So we try to design the pigment so that the pigment is presented to the formulation in its best form as we can, so that you get the most value out of that pigment for your formulation as well as for your process. So even though we manufacture towards these types of application areas, it's not to say that one does not necessarily work for the other, because they all will work just a little differently and offering you something unique from that particular product. A great example is powder coatings. Powder coatings kind of straddles that plastics and liquid coatings areas in a number of different color indexes. For example, there might be some pigment color indexes that are better if we choose from the plastics area grades versus the coatings grades. And then some are vice versa, where the coatings grades is a better choice for the properties than the plastics grade. So it's really a chemistry, formulation, dispersion process balance to be able to get the most out of the pigment as you can. And of course, not leaving out the area in the inks area. There are some products that could carry over from the ink applications that do give some unique properties that you might be willing to use and take advantage of those particular properties, especially if you're starting from scratch and formulating something new. We want to make sure that you have the right product for your needs, not necessarily it was developed for a plastics or a coatings grade. So this is we've used this chart a lot of times, and it's a very important chart to remember that the bulk of the performance will come from the actual chemistry. And then as a manufacturer, we can then shift the performance of certain properties one direction or another by the choice of the finishing and surface treatment that we put on that particular pigment. And so an example, again, we go back to the areas of the three different application areas: coatings, plastics, and inks, for comparing 3 grades of a pigment blue 15-3 and the impact of the various finishing techniques that we do. So just looking at a few properties across the board, if we start with the specific gravity, we see that the coatings grade has a higher specific gravity than the other two, and that could be resulting from some of a surface treatment that might be used. It also could be a more compactful drying process that gets that specific gravity up higher. Just one example. Surface area is another area to be very cognizant of, and this really helps to depict how much dispersant might be needed for that particular formulation. And the grade from plastics and coatings, they're very similar in terms of their surface area, versus the one for inks has a smaller surface area. So it's going to require less dispersant in that same type of formulation. So each of these areas where you can do some comparison work using a technical data sheet, helps to be able to understand what might be behind that particular pigment in terms of the finishing techniques used and how that might impact your specific formulation. It's not to say that that will help you in every case, and I do have some examples of that as well. So how does those differences impact performance? The three Pigment Blue 15.3s that we just took a look at from a property perspective. Here we see in a powder coatings formulation how it is impacting the impact resistance in this particular powder coating formulation. So on the direct, the plastics grade and coatings grade are very similar and very good responses, while the inks grade has a less of a response on the direct. If we flip that over and take a look at the reverse, then we see another difference between the plastics and the coatings grade, where the coatings grade falls off in terms of its response. And the inks grade still remains to have a lesser response in this formulation. So all of these have to go into your consideration when talking about a formulation and how these are impacted. Switching over to pigment yellow 110 and comparing grades. Here we have a plastic grade and a coatings grade in several different coatings formulation. We've compared a solvent-based polyurethane, a water-based polyurethane, and then a standard water-based decorative type formulations with these two grades of yellow 110. And in each case, the response for color development, the full tone, is a little different. But more importantly, the response for strength can be very different depending on the formulation that is being evaluated. So the solvent-based polyurethane provides a much higher strength response for the coatings grade over the plastics grade, where in the water-based polyurethane formulation, the two are identical in terms of strength as well as color development. And as far as, is there a clue from the properties? Yes, there are. We see some differences in the bulk density as well as the specific gravity between the two grades, and we can attest this to type of drying and milling differences that we put on these two grades, and to be able to meet the intended application area. If we stay with yellow 110 and take a look at particle size impact, here we are taking a look at the transparent version on your right-hand side of the screen and the opaque version on the left-hand side. And shape-wise, it's still the same shape crystals. There's long needle-like types of crystal shapes, but the surface area is almost double with respect to the transparent grade. That tells us that the transparent grade is going to need a higher amount of dispersant in that same type of formulation to be able to get a proper dispersion. How does that impact a finished formulation in terms of properties? Here we compared in a powder coating formulation the amount of flow that you will get with respect to these surface area differences and particle size differences. So we've got 4 different formulation types here, 2 with TiO2, a 1090 and a 5050. And in both those cases, there's just so much TiO2 there that it overwhelms the organic impact for this particular property. However, when we take a look at the mass tone type formulation, the transparent one, because it requires so much more dispersant needs, it does not flow as well as its opaque, larger sized counterpart. Opaque in the mixture with the carbon black, even though it's very much a almost a mass tone type formulation at 98.2% carbon black. The carbon black itself acts as a dispersant so that the differences become smaller in that particular type of formulation. So there are a couple of ways to get at dispersants in certain formulation types. If we move to the orange color space and take a look at chemistry differences, we talked about that earlier on, where chemistry is going to provide the bulk of the performance properties. Here we're looking at orange 36, orange 64, and orange 34. And again, in a powder coating formulation, the property that we'll evaluate is overbake stability. But the first thing that you notice um, is the strength of the orange 34. This is a typical example of a classical pigment versus a high performance pigment in a similar color space. The classical pigments will tend to have higher strength than the high performance areas, and this is just one example. But if we bring those chemistry differences into this technical property of overbake stability, we see right away, because the orange 34 is classical, has a lower heat resistance property. It's not a very good choice of a color index chemistry to use in a powder coating formulation because it is unstable at higher temperatures. Um, Take that aside and take a look at the two remaining high performance pigments. So here you want to consider what kind of color space that you want to be in. When TiO2 or carbon black is present, the two types of chemistries respond very similarly with respect to overbake stability. However, in the mass tone area, the orange 64 does have a deficit over the orange 36. So all of these types of properties and considerations go into your choice when you are selecting a pigment for your formulation. Staying with the orange 64s and taking a look at grade comparisons. Here we are looking at a coatings grade versus a plastics grade in that same solvent-based polyurethane type of a formulation. And in this particular case, the plastics grade is deficient in terms of strength when compared to the coatings grade. However, the color development, the full tone or mass tone, is very, very similar between the two. This is an area where if you compare the two TDSs, you would not necessarily see the differences in the performance based on what we see on the physical properties of the aspect of it, even though we know that there is differences in the finishing that we've placed upon each of these pigments. Orange 36, here we're comparing two different coatings grades. So within each application area, there always are going to be different grades within that application area. So just because they're both coatings grades, they're not always going to respond the same in every application area. So in this example, the 2916 grade develops to a more yellow full tone color with some additional strength available. This is one area where we can see the dispersant needs differences based on the oil absorption area. And knowing that we do have a difference with respect to surface treatment between the two grades. However, in a different type of formulation, there's a difference in terms of the response. So these same two pigments that we saw in the previous alkyd formulation was showing that the 2916 had a better response with respect to strength in this water-based polyurethane, and with the property being viscosity. The 2916 has a higher rheology profile than the 2915C. So again, it's matching up the actual product itself with your formulation needs. So we talked about whether or not you're going to be using an effect pigment in your formulation, and typically the using more transparent pigments is going to be your best choice to be able to get the most out of your mica or aluminum flake in your formulation, because you want to be able to create a nice deep color, and deep by meaning you can kind of see into it, and the mica and aluminum itself, the color can show through and be able to show that sparkle. So we use the mica effect pigments or any effect pigments really to develop very distinctive colors in our products that we're applying the coating to. Also because it is more prevalent for a buyer to choose an effect color, no matter what the space that color is in. So the first thing to consider is the size of the mica itself. The finer micas are going to have less sparkle. It's going to be more of a softer luster than sparkle. It will be less bright. However, it will provide some coverage or hiding to your formulation. The opposite, of course, is true with coarse pigments. They're going to give you much more sparkle and brightness, but they're not going to be there to participate in the coverage area. And typically what usually happens is it's a combination of finer sizes with the coarser sizes to take advantage of both properties of the good properties for each, depending on what you're trying to achieve with your formulation. So a couple of examples here to depict the size impact. What we have here is the same type of a purple mica effect formulation. On the left-hand side, the formulation uses 10 to 60 micron micas, where the formulation on the right-hand side uses those same exact micas, mica colors, but in a larger size of about 150 microns in size. So the formulas are exactly the same in terms of all the colorants. The difference here is just the mica size. So if you look at the right-hand side, or the left-hand side, I'm sorry, pictures, hopefully they come through well on the screen. But what we see is definitely, not as much sparkle, but you also see a lighter color because there is many more physical mica particles per gram of mica used because of that size aspect of it. So there's more particles, more surface area to be able to lighten the overall color. Compare that to the right-hand side where the micas are then almost more than twice the size. The base, the color itself appears to be a much more deeper, richer purple. And obviously then you can also see more sparkle from the particles. And you also see more space in between particles because of that larger size. So there's less physical number of mica particles in the same gram of mica. This is also even more of an example if we bring all of the micas up into the clear coat. So instead of being a typical base coat clear coat, this is the base coat tinted clear coat. Same formulation, just the micas are now in the front of or on top of in the clear coat. So that whiteness and lightness color is very much seen here on the left-hand side with those smaller mica particles in comparison with the larger particles on the right-hand side. Really does allow that purple color of the base coat to come through and accentuates the sparkle even more because they're in the top coat. So the other area, of course, is to consider what substrate you want to use for your for the mica. Choices are typically either a natural or a synthetic. On the natural side, they will tend to have less chroma, less sparkle, and however, they're going to be the more reasonable in terms of cost. Less sparkle because as they are natural micas being mined, there are many more edges and ridges that are present in the mica itself. So as the light comes in, it's bounced around and reflected a lot of times in the natural mica versus the synthetic mica, which has a very smooth surface and very defined, sharp edges to reflect the light that is coming in on each of those particles. The chroma difference is primarily a result of it being the natural being natural. It's mined depending on where the mines are. There is always going to be a certain level of contamination within the mica itself, and that color is going to come through into the final product, and so it's going to diminish a bit the chroma. Synthetic, because it is synthetic, it will be pretty clear, and so only the metal oxide that is placed upon the mica will provide the color for that aspect of it. Then, of course, there's the cost difference in here, and like in the size area, a lot of formulators will use a combination of the two to get the benefit of each one of them. So an example of how the substrate design can play a role in your color development choices. This example, actually, these are both going to be both natural micas. In each case, on the left-hand side of the drawdown is this traditional natural mica. The right-hand side of the drawdown is a new process that Sudarshan has developed for natural mica in an effort to capture the high chroma of the synthetic, but still maintain the natural mica platelet itself. So in each case, we see for the same particle size, we see a very large increase in chroma for these still natural micas. These were originally developed in our cosmetic business area, and we've been bringing these into the industrial segment over time to be able to capture the benefits from using a natural mica, but with the higher chroma. The blue that I have here in the middle, that is our radiant blue 41443 that we've recently introduced. So binders, of course, we are a pigment manufacturing company, so we don't have a whole lot to talk about with binders. However, they are of critical importance when selecting the pigments. As we've discussed already, there are many different types of coatings formulations, and each has their own pluses and minuses for the chemistry that it is for. And so what I like to always do is if we start at the bottom of a chart like this to determine what kind of performance you want out of your formulation, and then apply that to the type of application that you need to be in, and then working your way up, looking at the various technical properties of those types of resin systems, and that can help you determine what resin system is potentially best for your needs in your formulation. Then you come back to the pigment, and then we work with you to help you determine what is the best type of pigment chemistry and then pigment finishing to match with your resin system of choice. So an example of the resin system choice and how that interacts with the pigment and the finishing techniques. Here's two different powder coating formulations. The number one is a standard polyester. The number two is an acrylic epoxy hybrid formulation. And we've taken a look at a couple of different coatings grades as well as an ink grade in this formulation. And the property that we're evaluating here is pellet flow. So on the surface, if your standard screening formulation is just going to be a polyester type formulation, all three of these grades of pigments would perform about the same for this particular property, and so you wouldn't see a difference. However, we all know that you will have more than one type of formulation that you need this pigment to go into, and so if you stop there at that level screening, you could choose any one of these types of Pigment Blue 15-4 pigments. But if you have a acrylic epoxy hybrid formulation in your toolbox of offering, and you wanted to take advantage of pellet flow, then there are two better choices of grades of pigment to give you a higher flow, a smoother surface for your powder coating formulation. So it really depends on what you're looking for, how well or how spread out you want that pigment to go in your formulation toolboxes, and balancing all the properties. Again, just one property, but it's always important to consider that the relationship of the formulation and the pigment itself. And then lastly, obviously I'm skipping thinners and solvents for obvious reasons. Additives for a pigment manufacturer really is the dispersant of choice. Dispersion is the key area in terms of coatings. So we need to make sure that the pigment is wetted properly. It is ground to the appropriate size, and then once the size is reached, those particles are then stabilized so that it doesn't come back together. So ultimately, in your process, in your formulation, you're going to take that pigment right out of the bag in those big, large clumps of agglomerates, and you are going to mill it and stabilize it. And ultimately, you want to be able to have each of those particles at the right size, stabilized so that they do not come back together again and result in an unstable dispersion, which can settle. The strength can go down, can reduce considerably. The other aspects of it, you could start to show some grit in the formulation. So a number of different things can pop up if those pigment particles are not stabilized in the formulation. So in a previous webinar, we talked about dispersants in the past. In each dispersant, there's a portion that likes the pigment, and the other portion likes the fluid that the pigment is in. And those are important to match up to the pigment as well as the resin solution that you're working within. So we talked about a basic standard starting formulation for choosing the amount of dispersant and then laddering from there. It's really a function of the surface area. So the example that I'm sharing with you today is one that I've shared in the past. This Pigment Blue 15-2 has a surface area of about 67. And if I use this formulation, it tells me that I need a dispersant of about of the amount of about 17% of dispersant solids on pigment solids from the theoretical place. That would be the place to start. Our formulation that we use for this pigment is a solvent-based polyurethane dispersion. Our control formulation that we use is from BIC, the Disperbic 161. It is a 30% solid solution. BIC recommends a 9 to 27% solids on pigment solids. So our formulation is right there in the middle of that recommendation area. Our dispersion is 16% pigment loading. So if I use the calculation there, it would tell me that on a theoretical basis, using this starting formulation, I would need 9% of the dispersant on an as-is basis in my formulation. In actuality, our formulation is at 10%. So we had made that adjustment for the formulation along the way. So from there we took a look at the various types of other dispersants to see if we can improve upon the properties that we have with our current formulation. So we selected several from BIC for different purposes. We have a couple of high molecular weight copolymers, random copolymers in there. One was stated to be 4-phthalo blues, the 2200, and then the other one that was comes from their inkjet stabilization arena. Another one from that same arena is a structured copolymer, and we also decided to evaluate each of these with and without synergists. I'm sorry, which those are insoluble pigment complexes, sort of the pre-pigment is what I like to call them. So in this evaluation, we kept everything the same as our control formulation. We wanted to keep the pigment level maintained, the D to P ratio maintained, so that the only thing that we're comparing is directly the actual polymer itself, not necessarily optimizing the formulation for the polymer, but just the polymer to polymer comparison. So with that, just the little picture from before, the Disperbic 161 is a block copolymer, so it's either going to be the BAB, where the two tails stick out in the fluid, or the ABA, where the jump rope is the portion that sticks out into the fluid. The Disperbic 2200 and the BICJET 9152, they are random copolymers, so you can see that those all those jump ropes stick out into the fluid. And then finally, the structured copolymer is the BICJET 9131. So it gives you a little visual of what these dispersants are. Results in a couple of conclusions that we saw with respect to viscosity, which is one of the properties that we were looking at. In every case, for every dispersant that we looked at, including the control, the addition of the synergist improves that, lowers that viscosity considerably. If I just look at the solo dispersants, the 9152 was the better of all four of them in terms of viscosity. And ultimately, a couple of pairs of dispersants and synergists resulted in the lowest viscosity of all the scenarios that we looked at. So that's viscosity. The next property is transparency. And in this particular case, for the most part, the bulk of them were about the same. The best, most transparent was the Disperbic 2200 and Synergist combination. You'll recall that was the one that was recommended for phthalos. Color development. So this is an alpha blue. So the development wants to move in the direction of being the most red we can get out of the pigment. The blueness level also helps to go with the strength part of it. So in this particular case, the reddest and the bluest development was from either the BiCjet 9152 by itself or in combination with the Synergist. And then the last property, of course, is strength. As I mentioned, we always want to get the most out of our pigment for every pound that we put into our formulation. And in all cases, the Synergist did develop more strength for every dispersant that was evaluated in this testing. However, the highest strength came from the combination of the 9152 and the 9131 in that particular case, which sort of goes into the recommendation that is used for the inkjet application area, which is always something that is good, interesting to consider, because in that area you need to be able to have very fine particle sizes for those inkjet application areas. So if we take a look at the overall results from this area, again, as I mentioned, we kept the amount of dispersion to be the same. So we used 10% for all the properties. When the Synergist was used, we reduced the polymer amount by 4%, and that 4% was then the Synergist, so that the total was 10%. So as far as the selection, we talked about the Synergist adding as an improvement for the viscosity of all of the dispersants. And in each case, we did match the amount of dispersant to our control. However, when you look at the dosage recommendations of each of the three polymers that we evaluated, our dosage that we used was either at the very, very low end or outside on the low end of the dispersant. So we could increase the amount of dispersion used, but that would obviously add dollars to the cost the formulation cost. And it also, from a technical perspective, it removes formulation space from your formulation. So dispersant solids are taking up solids that you might want to use for something else in your formulation. So by adding the Synergist, we're still getting properties that we're looking for, but still maintaining that lower formulation space. And then the best balance of all of the properties that we took a look at was the 9152 plus Synergist for this particular color index and this particular product in specific. Because it provides the lowest amount of dispersant required. And again, that's a formulation space attribute. It also provides the highest strength, that value in use. So you're going to get more gallons of paint for that same gallon of dispersion with that particular combination. So you can find more information on our website. It's been about 6 months since we've updated the website. You can do that in two ways. Take a look at the Pigments tab and go down to coatings, and then you can find all of your sub applications in that area. Or if you know what color index you're looking for, you can put it in the Pigment Finder box, and then you'll see all of the pigments that we have in that color index to be able to review. So you can reach out to any one of us on the team if you have any questions or need some assistance. We're all here to help you make your best pigment choices that you can. So next up, next month, we will finish off the color space investigation that we've been doing before. We'll take a look at the green, blue, and violet space in the next session. That'll be in May. So take a look for that invitation about a week or so before. In June, we will have a guest presenter join us for that one, where they will take a look at a deeper dive into some ink application areas and what we've been doing in that arena. So you'll get more information with that a little bit later. So just again, we always appreciate you joining us for these webinars, and we hope to continue bringing you different type of topics along the way as we move through these areas. So with that, I'd like to open it up to any questions that you might have. Open the chat box to see if there's anything there. Okay, there's nothing in the chat box right now. So with that, I will close out the session. However, if you do come up with a question after the presentation, feel free to connect with me directly, and I'll help you out. And again, thank you very much for joining us today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care, everybody.